In 2023, one country held a national vote asking its own citizens whether to annex 2/3 of its neighbor's territory. And the roughly 700,000 people already living on that land never got a ballot. The border between Texas and Mexico is a single river. The borders of the Caribbean are something else entirely. Dozens of lines drawn across open ocean, sliced straight through the middle of single islands, leased out for gold coin, argued over in a courtroom in The Hague, and in one case, welded onto the side of a warship. So, let's get into it. Our 45 weird geography facts about the Caribbean's borders. Fact 45. A country is trying to vote itself into 2/3 of its neighbor. The Essequibo region makes up roughly 2/3 of Guyana's landmass, claimed by Venezuela since the 1800s despite an 1899 arbitration award that set the border. The dispute went quiet until oil was found offshore in 2015. In 2023, Venezuela held a referendum to annex the territory and later signed it into law as a new state. Guyana took it to the World Court, where it remains unresolved. Millions in oil rights are riding on a 120-year-old map. Fact 44. The smallest island on Earth, shared by two countries, has a border that runs through a parking lot. St. Martin is just 34 square miles, split between French and Dutch sides since a 1648 treaty. There's no fence or passport control, just road signs switching language. Locals cross for lunch without noticing. The line wasn't even fully surveyed and finalized until 2023, nearly 375 years after the split began. Fact 43. Almost the entire Caribbean has zero land borders, except for one. Every island nation here is bordered purely by ocean, except Hispaniola, split between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's the only land border anywhere in the Caribbean archipelago, running about 240 miles through mountains and farmland. Everywhere else, the border with a neighbor simply means open water. Fact 42. The river marking that one land border is named after a massacre, and it's the site of another. The Dajabon, or Massacre River, got its name from an 18th century clash between French and Spanish colonists. In 1937, dictator Rafael Trujillo used the same river as a killing ground, slaughtering thousands of Haitians in the Parsley Massacre. Today, the Dominican Republic is building a border wall along it, one of the only wall borders in the Western Hemisphere outside the US-Mexico line. Fact 41. A tiny uninhabited island has been disputed for over 160 years. Navassa Island is 2 square miles of limestone, about 40 miles off Haiti, claimed by the US since 1857 under the Guano Islands Act, and still run as a wildlife refuge. Haiti has never accepted that, listing Navassa in its constitution since the 1800s. No court has ever ruled on it, and the only regular visitors are Haitian fishermen who rarely even step ashore. Fact 40. A speck of sand smaller than a football field generates a maritime claim the size of a small country. Aves Island is 375 meters long and barely 4 meters high. Once split in two by a hurricane before coral stitched it back together. Venezuela keeps a small naval outpost there and uses it to claim a 200 nautical mile economic zone. Several Caribbean nations have formally objected at the UN, arguing a rock that can't sustain itself shouldn't claim an ocean. Fact 39. The US has been renting a piece of Cuba for over a century, and Cuba won't cash the checks. A 1903 lease gave the US a permanent base at Guantanamo Bay for $2,000 a year in gold, later $4,085, with no end date unless both sides agree. Since Castro's 1959 revolution, Cuba has refused every payment as a protest against what it calls an illegal occupation. The US still deposits the rent every year anyway. Fact 38. A World Court ruling handed a huge stretch of sea to a different country. Colombia's San Andres archipelago sits far closer to Nicaragua than to Colombia's own mainland. In 2012, the ICJ let Colombia keep the islands but redrew the maritime boundary, transferring a massive area of surrounding sea and its fishing and oil rights to Nicaragua. Colombia initially refused to fully comply, and a 2022 follow-up ruling ordered it to stop patrolling waters the court had already given away. Fact 37. A cluster of reefs in the far western Caribbean is claimed by practically everyone at once. Bajo Nuevo and Serrania banks are little more than shallow cays, yet Colombia, Nicaragua, Honduras, Jamaica, and historically the U.S. have all asserted claims over the fishing grounds and potential oil nearby. Court rulings have chipped away at the dispute, but full agreement has never been reached. On some maps, these banks belong to 4 or 5 countries at once. Fact 36. One Central American country claims more than half of its neighbor. Guatemala has never fully accepted Belize's independence, insisting a large chunk of Belizean territory belongs to it under old colonial treaties with Britain. In 2018 and 2019 referendums, both countries agreed to send the dispute to the International Court of Justice, where it's still being heard. If Guatemala somehow won outright, Belize's own capital could end up inside the disputed zone. Fact 35. The United States once bought an entire island chain from Denmark using gold coin, worried Germany might seize a Caribbean foothold during World War I. The U.S. paid Denmark $25 million in gold for St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John in January 1917. Denmark had tried to sell twice before and failed. Residents didn't get a vote either way. The date the flag changed, March 31st, is still marked today as Transfer Day. Fact 34. An uninhabited rock has been ruled by a king for over 150 years. Redonda is a waterless volcanic outcrop annexed by Britain into Antigua in 1872. 7 years earlier, an Irish merchant had already declared himself its king to celebrate his son's birth. That title got passed down through a line of British and Spanish writers for a century. Legally, Redonda belongs to Antigua and Barbuda. Culturally, it's still fought over by self-declared royalty. Fact 33. A rock off Martinique was officially commissioned as a warship in the Royal Navy. In 1804, a British commodore hauled cannons up its cliffs and garrisoned over 100 men there. Rather than build a normal shore base, which naval rules didn't allow, he commissioned the rock itself as a sloop, HMS Diamond Rock, and passing ships had to salute it. It held out against the French for 17 months before finally being recaptured. Fact 32. 2 countries separated by less than the length of a marathon are fighting over gas trapped between them. At its closest point, Trinidad sits barely 7 miles from Venezuela. The Dragon gas field, holding an estimated 4.2 trillion cubic feet, straddles the maritime border, closer to Trinidad's pipelines than to Venezuelan infrastructure. U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have repeatedly stalled deals to develop it, leaving billions of dollars in gas sitting just offshore and almost untouchable. Fact 31. 3 tiny Caribbean islands are, legally speaking, part of Europe. Bonaire, Saba, and Sint Eustatius aren't colonies of the Netherlands. Since 2010, they've been special Dutch municipalities, administered much like any town in the Netherlands itself. Just sitting thousands of miles away, residents carry Dutch passports and follow Dutch law more closely than a typical territory would. So a piece of the Netherlands, in practice, sits closer to Venezuela than to Amsterdam. Fact 30. An entire country dissolved itself in 2010 and split into pieces with completely different statuses. The Netherlands Antilles had grouped several Dutch islands together for decades. On October 10, 2010, it was dissolved. Curaçao and Sint Maarten became separate, self-governing countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, joining Aruba, which had split off in 1986. Bonaire, Saba, and Sint Eustatius went the other way, becoming special municipalities instead, all still under one crown. Fact 29. Millions of American citizens live behind a border they can't vote across. Puerto Rico has been a U.S. territory since 1898, and its residents are citizens by birth. They can vote in presidential primaries, but not the general election, and have no voting representation in Congress. Move to the mainland, and that same citizen can vote for president the very next election. No river or fence involved, just an internal jurisdictional line. Fact 28. A narrow strait between two islands has quietly become one of the region's most dangerous crossings. The Mona Passage separates Puerto Rico from the Dominican Republic, cutting through deep, unpredictable water. Because Puerto Rico is U.S. territory, it's become a common and often deadly route for people trying to reach American soil without papers, usually on small, overloaded boats called yolas. What looks like an 80-mile gap functions as one of the tensest maritime borders in the Caribbean. Fact 27. 3 Dutch islands sit closer to a South American country than to any other Dutch territory: Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao. The ABC Islands hug the Venezuelan coast so tightly that some points sit less than 20 miles offshore, nowhere near the rest of the Dutch Caribbean. That proximity has made them a frequent landing point for refugees during Venezuelan instability. Geographically, these islands belong to Venezuela's neighborhood. Politically, they answer to a government across the Atlantic. Fact 26. The only English-speaking country on mainland South America isn't considered South American by most of its own neighbors. Guyana shares land borders with Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname, but culturally and politically it identifies with the Caribbean, thanks to British colonization and Caribbean migration. It's a full CARICOM member and plays cricket instead of football. Geography puts its border against a South American neighbor. Everything else about it points squarely at the sea. Fact 25. A second South American country belongs to the same Caribbean club, and it isn't even English-speaking. Suriname, a former Dutch colony bordering Guyana and French Guiana, is also a full CARICOM member despite sitting entirely on the mainland and speaking Dutch. Between these two countries, the Caribbean's political community reaches hundreds of miles inland, wrapping around rainforest instead of coastline. Grouped by geography, neither obviously belongs. Grouped by treaty membership, both absolutely do. Fact 24. Guyana and Suriname have their own quiet border fight, separate from the Venezuela dispute entirely. Inland, the two nations have long claimed the New River Triangle. Offshore, they argued for years over their maritime boundary, a dispute with real money attached. Once oil exploration became viable, a UN tribunal finally ruled in 2007, splitting the contested offshore zone and letting both sides pursue development. The land dispute, however, has never been fully resolved. Fact 23. A stretch of the European Union's border sits on the South American mainland. French Guiana is legally an integral part of France, using the Euro and EU law, meaning its border with Suriname and Brazil is technically an external EU border. It's also home to Europe's spaceport at Kourou. Most people picture the EU's edges near Eastern Europe. One of its actual physical borders runs through Amazon rainforest, thousands of miles from Brussels. Fact 22. Britain still governs 5 separate territories scattered across the Caribbean. Anguilla, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Montserrat, and Turks and Caicos remain self-governing in local matters, but still answer to London for defense and foreign affairs. None have pushed hard for independence, largely because their financial services and tourism economies benefit from the British connection. It's one of the clearest remaining footprints of empire left anywhere in the world. Fact 21. One tiny British island sits close enough to hop over to 2 other countries for lunch. Anguilla lies a short ferry ride from both French Saint Martin and Dutch Sint Maarten, close enough that day trips between all 3 are routine. 3 flags, 3 colonial histories, all crammed into one small corner of the Caribbean, one of the densest clusters of international borders anywhere on the planet relative to actual land area. Fact 20. An island chain that speaks English sits inside a country that officially doesn't. Honduras's Bay Islands, including Roatan, were British-controlled for generations before being handed over in the 19th century. Residents there still often speak English or an English-based Creole as a first language, descended from British settlers rather than mainland history. Fly from Roatan to Tegucigalpa, and you cross an internal border, but also a far older cultural one. Fact 19. Nicaragua once leased 2 of its own islands to the U.S. for 99 years. Under the 1914 Bryan Chamorro Treaty, Nicaragua granted the U.S. long-term rights to the Corn Islands, largely to block any rival power from building a competing canal route. They were never developed the way Guantanamo was, and the arrangement was eventually dissolved. Today, they're simply Nicaraguan again, low-key beach islands most visitors have no idea were once leased away. Fact 18. A Colombian archipelago sits shockingly close to a completely different country. San Andres, Providencia, and Santa Catalina belong to Colombia, but Colombia's own mainland sits hundreds of miles away across open sea, while Nicaragua's coast is only a couple hundred kilometers off. It's the geographic mismatch behind the entire ICJ dispute mentioned earlier, a piece of one country floating deep inside what looks, at a glance, like it should belong to its neighbor instead. Fact 17. The Caribbean Sea hides one of the deepest points on the planet. The Cayman Trench plunges to roughly 25,000 feet, the deepest point in the Caribbean, and one of the deepest trenches on Earth outside the Pacific. It sits near the Cayman Islands, where the Caribbean and North American plates grind against each other. A real geological border running straight down through miles of ocean floor. Beachgoers on Grand Cayman are sitting a few miles from it. Fact 16. Right next door, the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean sits along a Caribbean island's edge. The Puerto Rico Trench runs along Puerto Rico's northern coast and drops over 27,000 feet, deeper than the Cayman Trench and deeper than anywhere else in the Atlantic. It marks the same plate boundary, generating serious earthquake risk for the island above. Puerto Rico's political border gets argued over constantly. Its geological border is far more extreme. Fact 15. A narrow strip of water between 2 islands has carried centuries of history through it. The Windward Passage separates Cuba from Haiti, only about 50 miles wide at its narrowest, funneling pirates, slave traders, Cold War spy ships, and modern refugee rafts through the same tight gap. Unlike the wide-open middle of the Caribbean, this stretch genuinely functions like a border checkpoint, just monitored by patrol boats and radar instead of a fence. Fact 14. Another narrow channel marks where 2 seas actually meet. The Yucatan Channel runs between Mexico and Cuba, roughly where the Gulf of Mexico gives way to the Caribbean Sea. Strong currents flow through here constantly, feeding into the Gulf Stream, which eventually warms coasts thousands of miles away in Europe. It's a border in more ways than one. 2 countries, 2 seas, and 1 current shaping weather on a completely different continent. Fact 13. The whole curving chain of islands east of the Caribbean Sea is the visible edge of 2 tectonic plates fighting each other. The Lesser Antilles Arc exists because the Atlantic Plate slides under the Caribbean Plate, melting rock and pushing volcanoes up from the seafloor. Some, including one near Grenada, are still active today. Every political border drawn across these islands sits on top of a much older, slower geological one that predates any treaty. Fact 12. One island in that same chain doesn't fit the pattern at all. Barbados sits slightly apart from the main volcanic arc, and unlike its neighbors, wasn't built by a volcano. It formed from an uplifted wedge of ocean sediment instead, giving it flatter terrain than the sharp volcanic peaks of nearby St. Lucia or Dominica. Geologically, Barbados is the odd sibling in a family of volcanoes, sitting quietly outside the chain it's usually grouped with. Fact 11. There's a nation within a nation tucked into the hills of Dominica. The Kalinago Territory, established in 1903, is home to descendants of the Kalinago people. the very people the Caribbean Sea is named after. Roughly 3,700 acres are set aside here under its own internal leadership, while still remaining part of sovereign Dominica. It's one of the few places left where an indigenous Caribbean community holds a formally recognized, self-governing homeland. Fact 10. 15 separate countries have partly dissolved their own borders against each other. On purpose. CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, links member states into something resembling a miniature European Union, pushing toward freer movement of people and goods across borders that would otherwise divide dozens of nations. It's an attempt to functionally undo, at least partly, the very fragmentation this whole list keeps describing for the people who actually live behind these lines. Fact 9. 4 different foreign powers still hold territory in the Caribbean today. Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States all administer islands, waters, or municipalities here in the 21st century, generations after most colonial empires dissolved. Nowhere else on Earth packs so many living remnants of competing empires into such a small, tightly clustered sea. Every flag flying here tells a story about wars and treaties signed thousands of miles away long ago. Fact 8. In 1983, the United States invaded a sovereign Caribbean nation and effectively decided who would run it. After a violent power struggle left Grenada's prime minister dead, U.S. forces landed under Operation Urgent Fury, citing the safety of American students and foreign military influence on the island. Within days, the government was removed and a new one installed, one of the clearest examples of a Caribbean nation's politics being settled by an outside power. Fact 7. During the tensest 2 weeks of the Cold War, the U.S. drew an invisible military line straight across the Caribbean. In October 1962, after finding Soviet missiles in Cuba, Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine, roughly 500 miles wide, to intercept incoming Soviet ships. It wasn't a legal border in any treaty sense, but for those days it functioned like one, a line the whole world watched, knowing crossing it wrong could trigger nuclear war. Fact 6. Nearly every maritime border in the Caribbean is completely invisible. Unlike the Texas-Mexico border, marked by over 1,000 physical monuments, almost none of the ocean boundaries here have any marker at all. No buoys, no fences, no signs. They exist purely as coordinates on treaty maps, enforced by patrol boats rather than anything a sailor could see. Cross from one country's waters into another's out here, and only a number on a GPS screen changes. Fact 5. One Caribbean border is so stark it shows up from space. Fly high above Hispaniola, and the line between Haiti and the Dominican Republic is almost impossible to miss. Not from any wall, but from a sharp color change in the landscape. Decades of heavier deforestation on the Haitian side have stripped away far more tree cover, creating a visible line where green forest gives way to brown, cleared land, a border traced by vegetation. Fact 4. Puerto Rico has voted on its own political future again and again, and nothing ever actually changes. Since the mid-20th century, Puerto Ricans have voted multiple times on statehood, independence, or their current status, with statehood winning narrow or contested majorities in recent votes. Congress has never acted decisively on the results. The island's constitutional relationship with the U.S. remains essentially unchanged, one of the oldest ongoing political status disputes in the Americas. Fact 3. The Caribbean Sea touches 3 separate continental mainlands at once. North America reaches down through Mexico. Central America wraps around from Belize to Panama, and South America forms the entire southern edge from Colombia to Venezuela. Layer in dozens of islands scattered across the middle, and you get a sea bordered by more distinct nations, territories, and legal systems than almost anywhere else on the planet. A genuine crossroads of 3 continents' borders. Fact 2. Almost none of these borders were actually drawn by the people who live inside them. From the 1899 line that split Guyana and Venezuela, to the 1648 treaty that split St. Martin, to the 1917 sale of the Danish Virgin Islands, most of the Caribbean's borders trace back to decisions made by European or American governments, often before the affected islands had any say. Many of today's disputes aren't new conflicts, just old colonial paperwork still being argued over. Fact 1. And in the end, none of these lines have ever stopped the Caribbean from being one of the most tightly connected regions on Earth. Music crosses these borders constantly. Food and language blend across them, and families split across island nations still gather for the same holidays every year. Governments keep fighting over gas fields, fishing rights, and centuries-old treaties, while ordinary people keep moving straight across the lines those governments can't agree on. And even now, as you're hearing this, at least 2 of these disputes are still sitting in a courtroom in The Hague, waiting on judges to decide where one country ends and another begins.